This is the continued story of the book I Saw God's Hand by E.L. Martin, as retold to the children of the Watertown SDA Church Primary Sabbath School. I'm your storyteller, Austin Bacchus. Let's go.
Chapter 14, Donnie and the Bright Shining Visitor. During the weeks that I visited the outstation teachers and attended the committee meetings in Port Moresby, I was continually praying for the 5 men I had left behind along the Tarama River, particularly for Haru, their leader, because I knew he'd be the one to make decisions. Due to some minor delays, it was 10 weeks before I was able to get back to the mission station, and Haru was there and had an amazing story to tell. I listened to this fantastic story, which was later confirmed by the person concerned. As I tell this story, no doubt you will find it hard to believe, but Pastor Herbert White of the Publishing Department of the General Conference can verify it, before I later took him to the area where the story took place, and he heard the story from Donnie as well. The Bible speaks of things happening that we would find hard to believe. Habakkuk 1 verse 5 says, "Behold ye among the heathen, and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it be told unto you." The upper Tarama River people, true to their promise, completed the canoe within a week. While they were working on the canoe, Haru and his team preached day by day to the people. As soon as the canoe was completed, Haru handed over the new axe, the knife, a file for sharpening the axes, and some fish hooks he threw in for good measure. Then he and his companions began their long trip downstream, spending a day or so in each village, sometimes more. One day as they rounded a bend in the river, they saw several small canoes, half a mile or more ahead. Some of these canoes disappeared into the overhanging undergrowth on the riverbank. When they reached the spot and looked, they found a small opening hiding under the underbrush, going into another tributary called the Wamuri River. However, by the time they found the opening, the canoes with the natives in them were nowhere in sight. Everyone except Haru was in favor of just going on. There was no village in sight, but Haru said, "Did not Pastor Martin tell us we were not to bypass one village? We must find where these canoe people came from." So they traveled up the small river several miles till at last they came to a village. Now I should explain that the Tarama villages were not villages in the true sense of the word, for there was only one house in each village, called a dubu, but it could be 100 or 200 yards long. One I saw was almost 400 yards long. Inside would live men and women, boys and girls, pigs and dogs, and on the sides of the dubu, about shoulder high, were racks and racks of human skulls, grim reminders of their cannibalistic feasts. On reaching the village, Haru's band was surprised to find that it appeared deserted. Soon, however, they found that the people were inside the dubu, enjoying a feast of human flesh. As soon as it could be arranged, Haru gathered the people together in a little clearing outside where he produced a picture roll and began telling the story of one who had changed him from a heathen to an ambassador of Jesus Christ. Haru said that he had been speaking only about 5 minutes through an interpreter when an old man, whom he recognized immediately as a chief, came in, sat down among the listeners, and almost immediately he jumped back to his feet and said, "Take notice of this, my people! It's true! It's true!" Haru continued his story, only to be interrupted intermittently by the chief, who would again say, "It's true! It's true! Take notice of it, my people!" Haru was impatient. He was almost exasperated because of the frequent interruptions. When the meeting was over, Haru walked over to the chief and said, "Have you heard this story before?" The chief answered, "No, never, but I know it's true." "Then somebody must have told you this story." "No, never." The chief was positive, but he emphasized, "It's true, I know it's true." Almost in desperation, Haru said, "Listen, if you know it's true, how do you know?" "My name is Donnie. Some weeks ago, I was asleep in this big dubu. I was awakened to see a man clothed in garments, so bright and shining, I could not look upon them. This man said, 'Donnie, you are to leave your village, go back in the mountains and build yourself a house there. If you do that, I will come again.'" Donnie was so impressed that early the next morning, he called his people together and told them what he had seen and heard, and he gave orders for the people to go into the mountains and build him a house. Now the villagers had never heard of anything so ridiculous, and they thought he must have become mentally deranged, but they dared not disobey his commands, for when a village chief speaks, his people don't ask the reason why, they just do what he says. A few days later, when the house was completed, Donnie was ready to take his wife and 3 children to the mountains. They objected strongly too, but they too eventually obeyed. The very first night that Donnie and his family were sleeping in their new home, the visitor came again, clothed in the same white bright garments, which Donnie described as brighter and much whiter than the noonday sun. The visitor said, "Donnie, tomorrow you are to leave your house and return to your village. You are to kill all your pigs. If you do so, I will come again." Now to carry out this command required more sacrifice, and should I say more faith, because his pigs were his wealth. Men bought their wives and their land with pigs. They could even settle differences with enemies by exchanging pigs. But as Donnie said, "More than anything in the world, I wanted to see that visitor again. So early the next morning, Donnie returned to his village and had all 70 of his pigs killed. His people, after this, now thought that he surely was long, which was their word for mad, crazy. For days and days they feasted on all the swine flesh, but Donnie refused to eat or touch any of it, and he wouldn't allow his wife and children to eat it. Back in his mountain home, the night after killing the pigs, the visitor came again dressed in the same way. This time he said, "Donnie, tomorrow you are to go out to your garden and bring in sufficient food. For the next day you are not to go to your garden, you are not to go fishing or hunting in the bush, but remain in your house. If you do that, I will come again." That day spent at home was the most wonderful day he had ever spent, because he felt he was in the presence of the visitor, even though he couldn't see him during the daylight. In the darkness on the night of that wonderful day of rest, the visitor said, "Donnie, tomorrow you are to go out to your garden. Bring in produce sufficient for several days. Place it outside your door, but do not use it. If you do that, I will come again." Donnie said that by this time he was prepared to do anything. For more than anything in the world, he just wanted to see the visitor again. He could hardly wait for the next visit. Yet he wondered why he should be told to bring the garden produce and not use it, but just leave it outside the door. So that night, when the produce was outside the door in several bundles, which they called billams, the visitor came again and said, "Donnie, tomorrow morning you are to go outside your house. There you will find a measuring rod by which you are to measure your garden produce. If you do that, I will come again." Sure enough, outside his house the next morning, there was a measuring rod, perhaps a little different from the types we're used to. It was a pole 4 inches thick and about 14 feet long. Donnie began with his cow, his sweet potatoes. He put the first one at the first mark on the pole. Then he noticed there was another mark, so he put one at that, and another, up to 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Then another mark appeared right near the end of the pole. It was separated quite a distance from the other 9 marks on the pole. So he put a cow, a sweet potato, on that mark too. And then he began from the beginning to do the same thing again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 1 by the 10. Not only did he measure out his cow like this, but also his pineapples, his pawpaws, his bananas, and all of his produce that he had brought in from the garden. There he left it all, not knowing his reason why. That night the visitor came and said, "Donnie, the food beside marks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 is yours. Do what you like with it. The food along mark 10 is mine. Put it in a billam, but do not touch it. If you do that, I will come again." In the dead of night, as Donnie was waiting for his visitor to come, all of a sudden the whole area seemed to be lit up. Within moments, the same bright shining visitor stood in his doorway. Donnie said he almost had to cover his eyes with his hands because it was so bright. This time the visitor said, "Donnie, tomorrow afternoon you and your family are to gather up all your food and my food and return to your village. When you arrive, my ambassador will be there. Give him the food that is mine. Listen very carefully to every word that he says, because you will know that it is true, it is true." And it was then, in telling the story, that Donnie handed Haru the billam of food. Donnie, in telling Haru the story, said, "That's why I kept on telling my people, it's true, I know it's true." When I heard this story from Haru, I immediately set sail for the Tarama area with him and his wife and family. Haru wanted to return to be with his people, as he called them now. I hadn't planned for this trip, but I felt that since I had heard Haru's story, it must take priority. I shall never forget my first night at this village. I forbade Kaura, Haru's wife, and his children to step off the boat, for we were among cannibals after all. While conducting my first meeting that night, I found it difficult to tolerate the stench of human flesh being cooked in the bamboo cooking tubes. Stench is the only word I can use, because the victims had been killed several days before, and this was the last of their meat. That night, Donnie himself told me of the bright visitor. After 2 or 3 days with the Warmuri people, giving 3 or 4 meetings each day, I said to Haru on the boat, "How would you feel if I were to leave you to make this your base and to extend the work to other villages?" Haru was jubilant. "I was hoping you would ask me to stay." I told him that my plan would be to sail for home the next morning, and I would take his wife Cora and the children with me, but I'd be back in 6 weeks, and then if he was sure things were all right, I would leave his wife and family with him. Cora, one of God's great women, spoke up and said, "Master, if Haru stays, I stay too." I sailed away the next morning, leaving behind Haru and his wife and family. 6 weeks later, I was back in the Wamuri village and witnessed a marvelous transformation. They had built a new village. The old dubu was no longer being used. Houses seemed to have sprung up everywhere. A church was being built. As I sailed up to the village, I found a line of about 200 people standing side by side, dressed in new lap-laps, or the loincloths that they would wear around their waist with a string. Haru said, "I want you to shake hands with my people." I shook hands and shook hands and shook hands. I asked Haru, "How come all these new lap-laps?" He said that he had selected 20 young men and had sent them by canoe to the mouth of the Tarama River to where there was a plantation. There they worked as long as it took to earn 10 or 12 lap-laps each. Then they returned quickly to precede my return. Haru not only organized the building of a new village and the purchase of new lap-laps for everyone, but he himself had visited people in all the nearby villages, and as a result of his preaching, they too were there to meet me. As soon as I found a few minutes to spare, I spoke to Donnie. Your people should really finish with the cannibalism, I said. Master, we decided to end that the first night after you left. We have left eating people forever. Okay, I said, what about the village people? Isn't it time they finish with their pigs? Donnie replied, there are no pigs left in this village. We killed them all. We won't even trade for pigs again. Donnie asked me whether I would baptize him while I was there. I hesitated. I told him I'd be back in another 6 weeks. If he wanted to be baptized then, I'd be glad to. I returned 6 weeks later, in fact 3 days under the 6 weeks, but when I arrived, Donnie was dead. He had been buried a few days before I arrived. Don't spare me, Lord, I thought, for not baptizing Donnie. I should have known better. You sent an angel from heaven to speak to him face to face. This experience illustrates how the prayers of the boys and girls back in the mission station were being answered, because Donnie first saw the heavenly visitor at the time that the students began their prayer bands. I feel my confidence in prayer, in their prayers, is justified. In the previous chapter, we had heard that when he announced he was going to go up the Toronto River the first time, that all the students in the mission school said, we're going to start praying, and they started praying for 3 weeks before he left. The whole story certainly put me on my knees. Donnie was a man who, on his own admission, had never seen a white man before. He had no contact with any missionary groups. Yet he received a lesson in health reform, kept his first seventh-day Sabbath, and learned about tithing before we even arrived. Do you wonder that the Master has 1,000 ways of finishing the work that we know nothing about? Some years later, when the work was well established in the Toronto River area, all cannibalism was gone. Haru, too, had sailed out into the sunset, dying with many sad, lonely hearts and tear-drenched eyes left behind. Why the Master permitted Donnie and Haru to sleep, I cannot quite understand, but the impact of his witness through them will never die. Haru and Donnie, without a doubt, were the two most unforgettable characters I've ever met, and I long with all my heart for the day when it will be my privilege to introduce each of you to Haru and Donnie in God's wonderful kingdom, where we will never part again.
Be sure to tune in next time for more stories from the book I Saw God's Hand by E.L. Martin. And meanwhile, feel free to check out these videos as well as others on my YouTube channel with many more mission and Bible stories for kids and adults. God bless you.